click subscribe and click the notification bell to never miss another scary story. I lived in the country for half my life, and for much of that time my family lived on a quiet mountain. But it wasn't always quiet. Sometimes you'd hear the coyotes crying in the forest. Sometimes you'd even hear the occasional gobble of a turkey. But every so often, you'd hear your parents whisper to one another about what the neighbors said to them. Something about a strange animal prowling the fields at night, about something attacking their dog. When the neighbors had one less dog the next day, you don't really feel in the mood to ask any questions. These are 5 allegedly true mountain monster sightings. If you want to share your story with us, go to darknessprevails.org. I Don't Know What It Was by CoyKoi. To begin, I live in the heart of the Great Smoky Mountains of East Tennessee. I was raised there. My best friend, who I'll call B, was born and raised here as well, and we've been close since we were barely 13. We're like sisters, and spent most of our time together, until we both got married and had families of our own. Now that you have a little background, I'll share a short but creepy 2-part story about what we saw one night by the river on Highway 129. B and I were working together at a local grocery store and had recently lost a coworker and good friend in a tragic accident. For the past couple of years, we had been going to a special boat docking ramp where you could walk in and out of the river safely. This had been our favorite spot to let loose in the summer and go swimming. It was close with easy access and it was free, perfect for a bunch of broke girls. We had decided to honor our friend's memory there instead of trying to remember where her family had scattered her ashes. We figured one special place was as good as any to celebrate our memories, so we made a habit of going swimming there. One year, about 8 years ago, B and I had parked on the gravel pull-off, climbed out of the car as the sun was getting low, and walked to the chilly water. This is a welcoming feeling in the early June heat, even at night, so we plopped down as close as we could on the concrete ramp without sitting in the water, just quietly gazing out over the river and the thick foliage that lined the banks. A few minutes of soaking our feet had passed when B said out of nowhere in her casual way, "You know, this would be a great place to hide a body." Now, she didn't mean this in a creepy way. We said off-the-wall things like this all the time, but never meant anything by it. So, knowing her the way I do, I laughed and agreed but jokingly shared my ideal place to hide one, should I ever have to. Once my rear was numb, I rolled up my pant legs and waded into the shallow parts of the water, while we began chatting about other things like work and video games. Everything had been pretty calm and quiet, except for the occasional passing car just above us. The sun had finally set, and the water was too dark to safely tread, so we sat on the ramp and began to stargaze. With more idle conversation, we were just admiring the brilliant night sky, when suddenly, a nearby bush began to rustle. We looked at each other, and I said it was just a critter to ease our minds. Of course it was a critter. We lived in the country where small rodents were always being cleared off the roads. We continued looking at the sky, but it didn't last long when that same bush and the flimsy surrounding trees started to shake again. As dark as it was, all we could see were the outlines of the leaves and branches bouncing as something shook them. Now we had our eyes fixed on the plants about 10 feet away, mildly curious as to what might scurry out from the brush. All of a sudden, B's eyes widened with horror as she shouted, cursing under her breath. We booked it up the ramp. I was behind her, sprinting up the hill and across the gravel in my bare feet, faster than I'd ever run before. Before I even opened the door, B had the car in reverse. As she peeled out and onto the road, I suddenly felt silly and wanted to laugh at myself for getting worked up over what was probably nothing. But before I could, my breath hitched in my throat. I was peering into the passenger rearview mirror when I saw the most terrifying sight. A tall, dark, and slender creature with gangly limbs stepping out onto the road from where we had just been seconds ago. The dull orange street lamp barely illuminated the shadow for me to even see an outline, much less what it actually was. I immediately darted my eyes back to the road ahead, hoping it was my imagination, hoping I had only been spooked by some animal. That's when B finally spoke up. "You saw it too, didn't you? You saw that thing." I didn't want to overreact, so I asked in turn, "What are you talking about?" "That huge thing," she replied, "across the road in the woods behind us." I could hear the nervousness in her voice as she spoke. Knowing she would know if I was lying even with a simple answer, I finally said, "Yeah, I did. What was that?" "I don't know," B answered. "But I do know that was no person, and it wasn't a bear either." That was the last time we went to that spot together, but it was not the last time I went. Fast forward a year later. I told this story to my new boyfriend, now husband, and it really piqued his interest. You see, he's a skeptic in every sense of the word, and was interested in potential proof of something supernatural. So we went as the sun was going down, and we sat there on the boat ramp once more. I bowed my head in a moment of silence for my lost friend, then started talking quietly with my boyfriend about how much she loved that spot when she was still around. We hadn't been there 10 minutes when all of a sudden, that same bush and trees surrounding it started shaking. I laughed nervously and told him that's what happened last time. I shrugged it off as coincidence and we carried on. But again the foliage began to shake violently, but there was no wind, not even a breeze. Not moving his eyes, my boyfriend said sternly that we should leave just to be safe. I thought he was more worried about it being someone rather than something, but when he said to back up slowly and walk to the car, I began getting nervous. Once inside locked doors, I asked him why he didn't want us moving fast, and he replied, "I can't explain it, but I felt like we were being stalked. I didn't want for whatever it may have been to chase us. I don't even know if I was overreacting, but better safe than sorry, I guess." I wish I could say we saw something that night, but we didn't. I haven't been back either, because I don't want to be caught off guard by whatever lives out there by the river. If you're ever driving down 129 on your way to Cherokee, North Carolina, be wary of the dangerous back road curves and the creature that might still live in those woods. No one knows what it is, but I do know it wasn't anything natural. Appalachian Mountain Wendigo by DarkStoriesAnonymous. It was an early Monday morning, cold and crisp. I had just begun to pack up for a week-long hunting trip. I had the tent and the bear traps packed into the back of the truck and tied down with a couple of bungee cords. I began the long drive at around 7 a.m. in order to get to our usual spot. My friend Clyde decided to tag along this time. It wasn't unusual for him to be interested in hunting, but this time he said something that I will always remember. "Can I go with you this time?" he said. "Be a shame if you went alone and never came back." He did sound confident in those words, but he was my best friend and I couldn't say no. We stopped for a little snack at the base of the mountains at a small gas station. There was an old man sitting outside in a rocking chair. He must have overheard me talking about the trip. Then again, me in my camo and hunter's orange was probably a giveaway. He said something to me that shook me to my core. "You'd better be careful up in those mountains. It's about time for the Wendigo to come." Now, I was far from a believer in mountain folklore and urban legends, so I brushed off his warning. Little did I know the trip would indeed be cut short, due to an encounter that I will never forget. It was almost 6 p.m., and Clyde had turned on the radio. There was a rapid decline in grizzly bear population about this time of year every year. I had asked Clyde if we should be worried, and he said not to worry about the grizzlies, as we were about to go set up traps anyway. I nodded in agreement and sighed a shaky sigh. It was 8 p.m. now, and the sun was going down. I grabbed a flashlight and headed down the trail with my friend Clyde. We had walkie-talkies to stay in touch over long distances, in case we got separated. They were for emergencies only, but we would occasionally use them to joke around. I had come to a small opening in between two bushes and decided to set a trap there. I covered it up with branches and leaves and marked it with a stick standing up out of the ground for extra precaution. On my trek to meet up with Clyde, I heard something, almost like a scratching noise, coming from my left side. I shone my light over to the side to see what it was. Oddly, the noise seemed to stop the moment my light flashed over the area. I walked closer to investigate and found 4 long scratches in one of the trees. Each one of them were about an inch deep and 1.5 feet long. I brushed off any ideas and just went with the old bear story. About 30 minutes into the walk, I heard a distant screech. Not much of a screech as it was a roar, really. It sounded like the squealing of brakes of a freight train, mixed with the growl of a dinosaur. My radio suddenly came to life with Clyde's voice.
"Tell me you heard that."
His voice sounded scared. I decided to tell him to meet me back at camp. Later that night, I told him that I was going to go check the traps as a routine hunter would do. It was about midnight now, and visibility was low due to the snowfall and darkness. I had come up to the trap that I had set earlier. Nothing seemed wrong, but the trap wasn't there. It was everywhere. It had been ripped in half. The bolts and springs were lying all over the place, and the leaves and branches were scattered about. To the right of the trap was a game trail, about 30 feet from the field. I had shone my light over there as I heard rustling leaves, and what I saw will forever give me nightmares. It was a tall, 8-foot humanoid creature with long claws the size of my forearm. Each breath it took was heard from my position, 30 feet away. It growled at me and slowly began to get down on all fours. Its limbs began to pop and crack into place as it leaned its body against a tree. It slowly made its way back into the brush line, leaving me alone and horrified, or so I thought I was alone. My light began to flicker, and as it did, the creature must have become agitated. It began to speed walk towards me, each stride covering 5 feet in length. Angry, it no longer wanted to leave. As it stretched out its arms towards me, the high-pitched screech I heard before I heard again, and the creature stopped, only 6 feet from me now. It opened its wide jaws. Then I heard Clyde's voice from about 40 feet behind me, calling my name. I had never felt so relieved in my life. His approaching flashlight beam had caused the creature to return to the woods with an evil-sounding hiss, etching itself into my mind forever. We ran back to camp, and I had tried to convince Clyde about how I saw the Wendigo, but all he did was laugh. He didn't believe in any supernatural entities or creatures, and he said he wouldn't start now. I finally convinced him to pack up our things and leave, and when I got back home, I just stood on my porch and waved bye to Clyde. I suddenly felt like I was being watched as well. I stared out into the woods across the road, and I swear, I saw it once more, standing there, staring at me. Moments later, it went back into the woods, and I never saw it again after that, though I do hear that same screech from time to time. To this day, I don't tell anyone else about it, afraid they wouldn't believe me. I never went back up in those mountains after that night, and you couldn't drag me there against my will. El Duende by Leviar Bladke. My name is Amori, and I live in Mexico. I'm 21 years old, and to be honest with you, I've had a lot of weird experiences. Back when I was 16, I was very athletic and used to go running every day after school to a big baseball field that's close to my house. There are a lot of hills and mountains all over the place there too. One day I was jogging around the baseball field because I had gotten tired from running on the hills and it was starting to get dark. I was going near the biggest tree as I was jogging, and I had a really bad feeling. The kind you get when you think you're in danger or you're about to be, and you need to get the heck away as fast as possible. But I turned to see in all directions, yet there was nothing out of the ordinary. Even so, the feeling did not stop. I just wanted to keep jogging and do as many laps as I could before it got all the way dark. On the very next lap, I was getting near that tree again, and the feeling came back worse than before. I stopped jogging and instead began to walk. I was looking all over the place, searching for the source of this feeling. At this point, it was getting irritating. My paranoia was keeping me from finishing the run. When I passed by the tree, that's when I heard a voice. I quickly turned around and saw that I was still alone, but I kept staring toward the tree until I heard the voice again. This time, due to its brief and subtle movement, I was able to see where the sound was coming from. There was a small, ugly thing with long and sharp nails, with a nose very long and covered in warts. It was laughing a horrible laugh when I saw it, and I was so surprised that I was paralyzed. I wasn't able to move as it began to laugh more and more, pointing one of its nasty nails at me. As if randomly, all of the sensation came back into my body, and I was able to tear up the soil once again, running for my life away from this thing. I ran and didn't stop until I got home, where I nearly collapsed. But I didn't tell anyone else about the experience until just a few months back. I was talking with a cousin that is Christian, but he also believes in fringe things like aliens. He was telling me that when he used to go to that baseball field himself, he would also get this strange feeling, and before I ever said anything about that tree in particular, he explained how there was a weird tree by the field, and that every time he passed it, all he felt was pure hate. And at one point, he began to avoid it entirely. I'm not sure what it was that I saw that day, but from the folklore and mythology I've read and heard of, it matches a duende, a small and mischievous fairy-like creature, one that you don't want to get on the wrong side of. Northeast Ohio Skinwalkers by SkinwalkerBlackout. I'm 22 now, and I'm an avid hunter and outdoorsman. I've always had a creepy, uneasy feeling about the woods near my house and all around the area, like something evil was always watching me or listening to me. I don't feel that way everywhere. My first encounter with what I believe was a skinwalker was about 7 years ago. I was out fishing with my best friend. We stayed up late fishing at a campout church thing that was being put on locally. I looked at my digital watch that had a built-in light. It was around 2:30 a.m. We were determined to win the little fishing competition the rest of the camp had going. There was also a fire about 120 yards away from us. We were sitting in lawn chairs by the nearby pond. My dad was set up in a tent about 300 yards up the trail beyond the tree line. And when I say pond, I mean a large banana-shaped pond that was stretched about 150 yards long by about 35 yards wide. A land bridge cuts across the middle that is wide enough for a truck or jeep to drive across. Now, we had been talking the whole night and had already been joking about Sasquatch and the like. We had a time where we weren't catching anything and we were quietly talking, when all of a sudden, we both began to hear whispering coming from the opposite side of the pond. It sounded like it was coming from the trail in the woods. On the other side of the pond, there is a runoff creek and a hill that jets up into the thick woods. I was perplexed by the sound and asked him what it could be. Nobody else was up at the time, or if they were, no one in their right mind would be walking in there at almost 3 a.m. That's when we saw my dad coming down the drive across the land bridge. I walked over and stopped him. He was genuinely worried about us and asked what we were doing. I told him we were just fishing. He asked us if we had been in the woods, to which I said no, and he looked at me funny. Now, this was 7 years ago, so I don't remember every bit of dialogue, but I remember what happened next so vividly, it's ingrained in my mind. My dad told me he had heard a whispering sound, but wasn't worried about it. But he also said that if anything weird happened, we should go straight to the tent so that we could get leaving. I nodded my head and said okay. Then I went back to my seat next to my friend. Sometime later, we heard a loud splash in that creek on the other side of the pond. I froze as a chill shot down my back. We didn't dare make a sound as we scanned the side of the pond. It was sufficiently light because of the full moon, and it was Friday the 13th. Yeah, I know, right? What are the odds? I thought to myself as I clenched my airsoft that I had laying next to me. My friend told me it was probably a deer and we shouldn't worry about it. I looked at him and said, "But deer don't go in the water at night. They can't see how deep it is." I don't remember his response, but he didn't agree with my statement. Then he quietly began acting a little more freaked out. Apparently, he had noticed something that I didn't. Then something happened that made us almost fall backward in our chairs. The most bone-chilling animalistic scream I'd ever heard in my life echoed across the campsite. It sounded like the high pitch of a mountain lion or cougar, but had a deep guttural growl like a bear. He got up and grabbed me, and we ran back to the fire. I quickly said to him, "We're definitely looking for tracks or signs of that as soon as the sun comes up, before all the other kids get up." Sure enough, the next day when we did go out there were huge footprints with 7 toes on them. From the depth of the claw marks on them, I would say what made them was at least 400 pounds. My most recent encounters include having 2 or more skinwalkers messing with me, running circles around the house and making ungodly noises deep in the woods, always following, always watching. They only seem to show themselves when me or my friend does something to anger them. I've been chased by something in my truck that was all black, like a living, breathing shadow. But there's another figure that's all white. I've even had full apparitions of medicine men staring at me on hunting trips and other activities in the same area. This is an ongoing nightmare. I'm not telling you what to believe or what to think. If you do believe me, great. But if you don't, that's fine too. But I feel like I've kept this story to myself long enough. A skinwalker is most definitely a shaman or Native American who performs rituals and essentially sells their soul for immortality. They gain the ability to shapeshift into animals or even other people. And that's what I think I'm dealing with. I know if these things wanted to take my life, they would have done it a long time ago. Nowadays, I sleep with a loaded and chambered 1911 45 ACP under my pillow every night. I never know when that shadowy black one might be on my porch, or the white figure one might be climbing the side of my house. So now, I'll always be ready. Early Morning Sighting by Anonymous. On a night not too long ago, I decided I should sleep on our trampoline outside. It was hot inside our house, and we didn't have an AC unit. So I wanted to sleep outside, as there was a nice breeze blowing in, with a wondrous moonlight above. I fell asleep quickly around 10 p.m., having thought it would stay quiet, until around 3 a.m., when I was awakened by sounds of something roaring or yelling. I had heard similar sounds before. I live on a reservation in San Carlos, Arizona, and there can be a lot of drunks at times. But this was different. I mean, at first I naturally assumed it was drunks, but then I really heard this ungodly cry. It made my eyes widen. My heart felt as if it had stopped beating for a moment. I arose with excitement and immediately ran inside to get my shoes and grab a flashlight. I wanted to investigate. I ran back outside and still continued to hear the sounds. They were a good 3 miles from my house. So I hopped on my bike and set out to investigate. I had to follow the back roads that lined up with the train tracks as I got closer and closer to the noise. I also began hearing dogs barking. My 2 dogs were following me as well as we continued heading toward the sound. The bike ride took maybe 20 minutes to get within closer range of about 500 yards of the sound. It was then and there that I had to ditch the bike because of the soft terrain. I started walking with my flashlight, ready to spot this thing. I could then hear footsteps that were so loud and heavy that they shook my chest every time they hit. It sounded as if something was running through soft sands. I continued, trying to catch up with the thing. But whatever it was way too fast. I didn't know if I was going to be able to catch up with it. Eventually, I decided to yell out to it. It was nearly 4 a.m., and I was 5 miles out in the middle of nowhere at that point. I began walking back and came onto the train tracks when that ungodly cry echoed again. I looked up to see this creature walking onto the train tracks as well. Crossing it, it was maybe a good 200 yards from me. With the moonlight as bright as it was, I was able to see this thing somewhat clearly. I estimated it was about 8 feet tall, had dark brown fur, and those eyes, I swear to God, they glowed like an almost yellowish red. And it stank. It reeked like rot. My dogs that were beside me began crying. Then they bolted away from me, going back home. This creature, which I was guessing was a Bigfoot, had looked at me for a couple of seconds and then left, completely disinterested from me. I was frozen with fear and yet also filled with excitement. I should have run home afterward, but I pressed on after it. I had to see more of it, but little did I know I'd get what I wanted in a terrifying way. Now the time was 4:16 a.m., and the sun's light began to slowly show over the mountains. I kept going and going until soon I had lost sight of my target. I continued to look, but it was like it had vanished into thin air. I was puzzled, thinking, where could he have possibly gone? And then I heard movement behind me, rapidly approaching in my direction. I turned quickly to see this thing running up to me. I just barely dodged it, jumping out of the way, When I looked back up, I saw that it wasn't just one of the things. There were 3 of them. I thought to myself then that this was how it ended, that I went too far with my curiosity. They slowly began to close in around me. I backed myself up against a tree, knowing even if I tried to fight my way out of it, these creatures were just too strong for me. I prepared myself, grabbing a large branch, ready to defend myself with all my might. One of the creatures screamed. It was around that time that a group of angry and ravenous wild dogs appeared and began to nip, bark, and attack the creatures. There, I saw my escape and did not hesitate. I threw the big branch down on the ground, and I ran like a bat right out of the underworld. I soon made it to my bike, and just as I was about to pedal off, I saw a massive stone coming right for me. I jumped out of the way and saw it hit my bike, busting off one of the wheels. So now I was running until I made it back to the train tracks. There I saw the bridge, and I began to run over it. I eventually made it home, terrified and exhausted. It was easily the most terrifying and exciting experience of my life. Later on, I did go back for my bike, and when I did, I found one terrible reminder of the events of the previous night. One of the wild dogs that had attacked the creatures lay there, lifeless, its body bent and broken almost beyond recognition. I couldn't help but wonder, that could have been me. Be wary if you ever find yourself exploring the mountains. Pray that you don't go alone, that you remembered to bring a friend, because all mountains are the mountains of madness. There are things that live and reside in the mountains that humans stay away from for good reason, even if we have forgotten why. I hope you enjoyed these allegedly true mountain monster sightings, and here's to never having to encounter a monster of your own. Good night. Be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. Don't forget, you can send me your stories at darknessprevails.org. If you want to support this channel, you can go to patreon.com/darknessprevails. Donate any amount, and for as long as you donate, you get access to ad-free MP3s of each episode, and you'll get your name in the credits at the end of the videos. Or you can support me by clicking that shop button below, or going to teespring.com/stores/darknessprevails to check out my merchandise. Thank you. Now, as usual, here are my 5 favorite early comments from the previous video about 5 disturbing dark web stories. Zeppelin Girl 86 says, "Don't order those deep web boxes." I know, right? You could probably get all that stuff for $20 at the Dollar Tree. Shaking my head because people spend way too much money. Damasa Music says, "It's been a long time since your last dark web stories. Nice. Believe me when I say I get excited to cover topics again, especially my favorites, like werewolves, skinwalkers, wendigos, and dark web stories." Tony Bird says, "Just in time for darkness and chill." Sounds nice. Getting scared and getting some. No Need says, "I got here so fast, my mind went blank. It's like losing my V card all over again. For many of us, that must have been a great feeling you had. But from some of us, I'm sorry you had to live through that again." And Heath Stedman says, "Only thing on the deep web I found is alien conspiracies, 4chan sites, and funny deep art projects." Yeah, that's what I figured. I'm very skeptical of any dark web stories. Even still, it's hard to deny that some even scarier things happen on the internet. And from time to time, people do stumble upon them and get scarred for life, if they live through it. Anyways guys, thanks so much for tuning in to another Darkness Prevails episode. More scary stories are coming soon, so stay tuned. Until next time, here are the credits to my patrons who are awesome people. Remember, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.